Okay, welcome to round 5 of Worlds. We'll go through the panel and indicate our preferred gender pronouns. I'm Steve Whittington from formerly Victoria University of Wellington, and I go by he or they.
I'm Kristen, she.
I'm Natalie, I have no preference.
I'm Robin E.
I'm Apple from the US of Singapore, she.
Okay, we'll now go to the teams. If you can also indicate the order in which you're speaking, and we'll start with opening up.
Sure, I'm speaking first, Kyle, and he or him is fine.
I'm speaking second, Rishabh, he, him is fine.
And opening opposition.
Speaking first, Connor with one N.
Speaking second, Connor with 2 N's, he, him.
Speaking first, Joanna, she or they. Speaking second, Evie, she.
Jesse, he. Drew, he.
And speaking in that order, he's first. Okay, the motion for the House is this House believes that the US should withdraw from East Asia and cede regional hegemony to China. Unless anyone has any questions, I call on the Prime Minister to open the case.
Panel, whether you think it's unfortunate or not, the reality of the political sphere is that China is set to overtake the United States as the regional hegemon is East Asia. The question in this debate is not whether or not they overtake us, but how they overtake us, and whether that process is smooth or one that is violent. 5-part model from opening government. First, we will engage in brokered negotiations with China. The terms of these negotiations will include things such as respect of borders and international cooperation with the United States. This will happen over an extended time horizon. We imagine about 10 to 15 years is about the amount of time that we'd want for a full transition to take place. Third, we will include in the short run, for the foreseeable future, the types of provisions that the United States is contractually bound into. That includes, for example, a troop presence in Japan. It includes also a presence in South Korea temporarily. In the long run, we'll seek to find ways to remove that also. Fourth, if China breaks their terms, we will return in full force. That will be an explicit term of the contract. And finally, we believe that all of this will be conducted in exchange for economic liberalization, or at least cooperation with the West, and these types of broad factors that are oftentimes in the United States' regional interests. With that in mind, 3 arguments that we want to advance. Yeah.
So wait, what are the terms that you're supposedly going to be able to enforce on China?
Okay, so if you're referring to the final section that we were discussing, we're talking about economic cooperation, trade deals, removing preferential trade with regards to the United States to allow for more easy access. These are the types of regional interests the United States so often has. First point of substantive that we want to advance is why China will overtake regardless. There are a variety of reasons this is true. First, we need to look to their economic hegemony within the region. They have a direct proximity to other nations, which always gives them an innate advantage over the United States. We see that they're building durable bonds with nations in the area, nations such as Mongolia, which they've already had strong ties with, but also throughout Southeast Asia. And we think that as time progresses, this is likely to be more strong rather than less strong as a result of the fact that they're able to provide resources directly. But we also think that their general economic power is growing. The catch-up effect of economics predicts that nations previously behind will be able to enjoy improved growth over the long time horizon on the basis of building up more larger base of technical capital that they can use to capitalize on the large population that they have. As this happens, they are set to have a continuing growth rate that far exceeds the United States in terms of the region, and is also comparable and very competitive with many other nations in the region as well. Given that this is the case, we think as an economic power, they're going to be one of the major players in the world order, and given that Asia is the base out of which they operate, it is likely that they will use their economic influence to manipulate it there. But we also need to deal with the political alignment as well. We suggest that it is broadly the case that people are fed up with American imperialism in the region. This is borne out empirically by the revolts that we see in Japan and Vietnam about US troop presence. We think as long as our troops remain stationed in this area, sentiment grows against them, and as even our allies begin to turn first lukewarm on us and then at last as foes, there becomes a situation in which exit is no longer easy. Third, Third, we see military power, that they've recently developed their first aircraft carrier, that this allows for them to have a direct presence. But ultimately, we think the damning blow will be in political will within the United States. All major political players are recommending inward turning and removal of the United States being a world policeman, which means that it is likely that this will be the policy of the next administration. But very particularly, we see an increased focus on the Mideast that makes Obama's Asian pivot seem unwise. Given that, we second want to talk about why we believe our brokered deal itself is preferable. First, because it establishes a durable relationship in the area. We think cooperation with them gives us agenda-setting powers, which allows us to work in cooperation rather than conflict. No. Second, under this, we believe that in the modern era, soft power is growing increasingly more important, which means the military techniques that we're using are becoming outmoded. Why is this the case? First, you have fast response times from allied bases, from the types of planes that we're developing, from the ships that we have, even outside of the region. Second, of course, nuclear projection means that we don't really need battleships there. They're serving very little purpose. Because of mutually assured destruction, direct military conflict is not something that is anticipated to occur. Third, we see increasing economic dependency makes it very unlikely that nations would ever want to engage each other through military means, because doing so is mutually deleterious to all parties. But finally, we see international organizations and legitimacy seem to matter much more in the new international regime. Given this, we think we trade a more or less useless coin of hard power on our side of the house into a much more useful coin of soft power, which we can use to actually be able to influence real outcomes. But also, we think that all the waste that we see associated with this hard power fade away given that. Third, under this, though, we think it makes the transition period itself conflict-free. In a world in which the United States leaves kicking and screaming, there is always problems with regards to how our allies cooperate, whether or not they're willing to cooperate with China, and given that these terms have not been clearly brokered, it is much more likely that they engage in something like a direct attack on Taiwan on our side of the house than in ours, where we are able to broker those terms and monitor our actual removal from the area slowly and over an extended time horizon. Fourth, we believe that we reduce waste in the region. We think that maintaining troops is particularly expensive, and that there's no reason that the United States should be continuing to patrol the area and station battleships, especially when doing so has been proven to ferment the types of anti-American sentiment, which oftentimes lead to terrorist campaigns, which ultimately harm all of the world's security. We think these problems can be greatly allayed by giving the hegemony to the body who deserved it in the first place, and one which will ultimately be a more responsible caretaker. Given that, the third point of substantive we want to discuss is why we think we get a more stable world on our side of the house than that the opposition will provide. First, we think that there is less contentious engagement. While open military conflict is unlikely to occur, when our battleships periodically bump into Chinese battleships, it generally tends to fray our economic and political relationships and makes them far more likely to support things like proxy wars or conflicts in other regions. We see China is actively trying to undermine U.S. interests in the Middle East. We posit that this is much less likely to happen in a world in which we engage in this type of brokered deal, given the conditions that we described, than in the alternative world. Second, we reduce the emphasis on military buildup broadly. We think the presence of the United States makes China feel that in order to show its power, it too needs battleships in the region. The problem of that, though, is not just the actual waste that is incurred when China engages in this action, but the signal that it sends to the surrounding community, which makes it more likely that other nations engage in other types of regional arms buildups, which we tell you is not only enormously wasteful, but also more likely to promote the types of small-scale conflicts that you sometimes see in the outer fringes of this area. Third, we think we solve for, we get a broader amount of economic growth in the long run and produce a more stable regime. We think the example of how North America has prospered under the United States is a good indicator of the ways in which strong regional hegemony can avoid the types of conflicts which oftentimes are barriers to the types of trade and economic exchange, which makes the entire region much better off. What you see is a distinct polarization currently, because there is not one but two regional hegemons in the region, and the conflicts that creates is that because some nations are aligned with one, and some nations are aligned with the other, these nations are always infighting and are not willing to cooperate on the types of projects which are necessary for the security and well-being of the region. But all of that goes away in a world in which it is consolidated behind a single power. We think that because China is clearly posed to assume this responsibility, it is therefore more capable, and that ultimately, therefore, it is the power which has the most ability to do good in the region. We think it is in the best interest of both the United States and the world. We are very, very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister and invite the Leader of the Opposition.
China as a non-democratic, unaccountable, and increasingly imperialistic actor is not a good actor in the region. And when we cede influence in the region, they will continue to extend their military influence. They will continue to economically strong-arm nations in Southeast Asia, and we think they will generally spread their influence in an undue and poor manner that is bad for the region as a whole. I'm going to outline to you two general pieces of constructive. First, how I think this increases militarization in the region, making everything more risky, making everything more likely to lead to actual genuine conflict, and allows China to continue its imperialistic tendencies. Second of all, I'm going to talk about economics, and why I think this allows China to economically strong-arm nations, and also makes the world in general less interconnected and less economically dependent, as OG is actually talking about, in a way that actually makes conflict on a global scale more likely as well. But first, let me talk about what we heard from opening government. The first thing they tell us is that, like, hey, Chinese is gaining more influence and they're becoming basically a bigger economic actor in the world. Like, yes, we agree this is the case. But the status quo is such that nations in the region are hedging their bets. They continue to trade a lot with the United States, and they continue to trade a lot with China. We think, if I can prove to you, as I hopefully will later in my speech, that nations are now going to predominantly trade more with China and less with the United States, this does lead to a world in which China has a much more effective economic hegemony on this region as a whole, which then creates a polarized and problematic world I'll talk about more in a moment. He talks about how certain nations are fed up by American imperialism. The only examples he states are Japan and South Korea, and will tell you, well, in his model, we're still going to have troops there. But for most of the other nations, this is just factually untrue. With countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, all really like American influence in the regions because they fear the Chinese imperialism and they fear expansion of their troops. So this is just not true in terms of political will. In terms of political will in the USA, also factually untrue. If you've watched any of the Republican debates, they all talk about limiting China. Even Obama's pivot to Southeast Asia, visit to Asia, is also influenced that clearly there's political will to put limits on China in this region. Okay, in terms of nuclear deterrence and how this will not actually lead to, we don't actually need real military deterrence in this region because we have nukes and therefore, like mad, we'll stop this from ever happening. Okay, simply not sufficient, right? Because first of all, you have smaller conflicts. So I point to like Crimea and Russia, right? It's clear the United States is not willing to take extreme military action, even when a weaker actor takes military action in a region that's clearly against international law. So clearly nuclear deterrence is not sufficient as long as they're taking smaller imperial actions. They're not going to make movement on that. We also, so clearly that's not sufficient deterrence. In terms of economic dependency, I think we get more economic dependency on our side, which is a good thing in terms of like decreasing the chance of global conflict. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And finally, it talks about broker terms and how because we have this influence, we're going to be able to broker better terms with China, make sure they don't invade Taiwan, stuff like that. Basically, what we would tell you is that if I can prove to you again that we have more bargaining chips on our side, we have more ability to influence Chinese policy, and I think having economic and military influence gives us more bargaining chips so we can say, hey, look, we will move less, we will either move some of the ships, or we will, give you specific economic deals that do benefit you, that do privilege you more in exchange for certain political deals. When we see that economic influence, we see the ability to make those trade-offs. Okay, first argument, militarization. No, thank you. So, first of all, I told you that there is situations in which we clear nuclear deterrence and our global military power is clearly not sufficient, especially because political will in the United States has shown over time that we are not willing to engage in global wide-scale conflicts. The United States has continually shown in Syria by not crossing Obama's red line in terms of all the stuff that Russia's been doing. Clearly, the United States is not always willing to act. So is China actually imperialistic? Will they continue expanding their borders and trying to gain more territory? I point you to a whole bunch of examples. I point you to Tibet. I point you to continued threats to Taiwan. I point you to Kashmir in terms of India. I point you to the South China Sea, obviously. All of these cases are showing that China continues to expand its military influence. And I think the only thing that's tempering that movement, the only thing that's preventing them from expanding even more, is the presence of the United States military and the consciousness that if they do make a quick action, the United States will instantly respond. So we think this prevents continued autocratic invasive action. I'll take back half.
America has a presence in Japan. Nonetheless, China still flew planes over territory they weren't allowed to. How influential is America at actually stopping China's action?
No, that they're just barely flying planes over, right? What we're claiming is that the actions would be far more extreme if there was not American troops there, American battleships there, ensuring that the Chinese don't take stronger actions. The second thing I want to talk to you about is local armaments. This region is reasonably unmilitarized, especially in Southeast Asia. For the most part, there is not all that much local military because the the local militaries recognize that they can trust the United States in the case that there ever is a regional or global conflict. When we take away that assurance, when we take away the ability for the United States to instantly respond to any conflict, they become fearful and far more likely to expand their own military capacity. We think this is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. We think it's one, problematic because it creates a powder keg in the region. We don't think many modern conflicts come intentionally, right? Like, we think a lot more modern conflicts are likely to come from, like, accidentally shooting down a jet, for example. That type of thing, accidentally, like, shooting a submarine. When you have far more local armaments in the region, I think that's more likely to happen, especially when there's no assurance of another global hegemon creating that safety for you. We think it also means there's more likely to be international in terms of the other nations in Southeast Asia to have conflict. Because once they build their own military capacity, I think they're also more likely to be invasive or use their influence to take over other regions or influence economics. Okay, economics, second argument. So note that China already shows a tendency to strong-arm other nations in the region. This comes in the form of, first of all, ensuring that there's heavy Chinese ethnic populations gain huge amounts of wealth in the region and influence economic policy in a manner that's highly neocolonial. So you have Vietnam making huge complaints against China because of the way that they influence their economic policy. We think this is generally bad. I think they're going to continue to do this. We see things like currency manipulation and devaluation in a way that as well allows them to control and manipulate the economic factors in the region. We have the creation of an Asian Infrastructure Bank in which they have a 26% share and a huge influence over other nations to control who actually gets funding and who doesn't. Ultimately, we think China has a huge influence over economic policies. So I told you earlier, right? The status quo is that nations are hedging their bets and they're willing to trade with one nation rather than the other. But this is ultimately signaling. It's signaling from the United States that they're unwilling to protect their allies, and it's signaling from China continually, and more as I've claimed earlier in my speech, that they're going to continue expanding and continuing being more invasive. It shows to nations that if they want to form economic ties, the ones that they must form if they don't want to be invaded or have imperial actions forced upon them, are actions that align themselves with China. So what China is likely to do is present and perform preferential trade deals with only Southeast Asian nations that force out the rest of the world, that force out the United States. Ultimately, what that means is a world that is less interconnected, far more likely to lead to conflict, and that is why we are proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, when they concede that China is growing in power, when they concede that China is growing in influence, what we tell you that comparative this debate is not about whether China will eventually have power, it's about when. And the question that the pathway that we're providing to you is a pathway that is more peaceful, is a pathway that is more beneficial for the world as a whole. 3 questions for today's debate. First, which side best why is China's growth ultimately inevitable regardless of the US's influence? Second, which side reduces the risk of short-term conflict? And finally, which side contains China the best, right? Which is where most of my substantive come from. So first, why is Chinese power inevitable? Now we recognize the US does have the capacity to intervene, but the question comes out due to the interest, right? We think that Southeast Asia is clearly more important to China than it is to the US. We see this already with their growing economic power, for example, the trade deals, exactly the development by that bank that they've just created to try and invest in Southeast Asia, right? We think it's really important to China that this Southeast Asian region is true. Now we secondly tell you that in terms of political will, the US doesn't have the same kind of interest in the region. They gave us the example of Crimea, right? For example, the US didn't intervene in Crimea, which clearly shows that the US doesn't always intervene to protect its allies when it doesn't think that in terms of its decision-making calculus, that decision is actually beneficial for you. So what we tell you is when you shift the debate to thinking about which side has the most interest in the region, we think it's clear that China does, and what that means is China is going to make the larger military, political, and economic investments that will allow it to eventually grow into that region. So what are the implications of this analysis? We tell you, therefore, the US has 2 choices, right? First, it could try and fight away kicking and screaming, which is only going to increase its cost and therefore not contain China's influence, or B, B, it can use our model to try and broker negotiated rules and regulations that ultimately benefit the US itself and ultimately benefit the world as a whole. We give you the analogy of the Soviet sphere of power in Eastern Europe, right? We gave the Soviet Union that part of the area, but ultimately that helped us contain them, ultimately that helped us protect them. Okay, second main question, right? Why does this reduce the risk of conflict as a whole? So firstly, we tell you that it's factually untrue that Southeast Asia isn't militarized, right? Singapore, for example, has national service and invests significant amounts of money into its national defense. We say the same thing is true between Malaysia and the same thing is true of Indonesia, right? These countries are actually already quite militarized. But the question becomes then, why do we think that this kind of strategy of containment is better for us? We think right now China is on edge, right? When you have the US military power in the region, for example, the US general flying over those contested Chinese islands, what we think is that significantly threatens China, makes China feel like it needs to act, and makes China feel like it needs to launch a preemptive strike to ensure that no kind of military action ultimately hurts it. So what we think this does, ladies and gentlemen, is it significantly increases the risk of conflict in the short term, because China feels like the only way to protect itself is to launch certain kinds of preemptive strikes or engage in proxy conflicts that we're already seeing taking place in Vietnam, for example, that ultimately allow it to grow in power. We think this is far reduced when you give China that sphere of influence, just like we did with the Soviet states, right? And you allow it to have that kind of insurance policy that gives us the negotiation and the capacity to reduce its influence as a whole over the globe. So if anything, it's our side that reduces the risk of conflict. And furthermore, we also tell you we think it's inevitable that there's likely to be certain kinds of conflicts if the US continues to exert its presence in the region, continues to have a greater and greater power in the region. They gave you the analysis of the status quo where countries are hedging their bets. We think this is true, but when China grows in power over the next 5 or 10 years, that hedge will significantly fall in favor of China, which means the only way the US is going to be able to maintain power is through either direct military or economic conflict, which we're going to get to later. By the way, part of our conditions that we have allow for free trade to take place, right? That was part of the conditions that was clearly outlined in our model, not responded to. Before I move on.
Okay, so at the point where Japan is only a slightly smaller economy than China and is much more highly developed than China, why would they not militarize to the point that we end up seeing not total Chinese hegemony?
Well, okay, that might happen, right? If that happens, if Japan does act as a counterbalance against China, we don't actually think that's a problem. And if anything, that puts a check on Chinese influence that we think is not necessarily a problem. But if anything, we still tell you that China has greater military power, China has greater political power, which allows it to overrule Japan. We think that's what's going to happen. Chinese economy is growing anyway, and it has a greater power in global institutions. But okay, now into the second, the key question, right? Why do we best contain China? We've already given you the analysis that we significantly reduce the risk of any kind of conflict from taking place. But here's the key link that they completely missed in this debate. We're trading off here regional power for China in the interest of greater international power, right? What we're essentially doing is telling China, hey, you can have this part of the region as long as a result of our deals and as a result of our negotiation, we get a greater influence in an international sphere. We think what this ultimately does is it contains China to a particular region and limits its power to expand, limits its ability to further grow. We see this already taking place. For example, China basically going around Africa, cutting trade deals with all their dictators in order to exert power in that region. We think that we have the power and the capacity to limit that when we give China when we trade off this regional power in China in response to greater international power. We think our model is the only one that actually has the capacity to do this, because right now we're the ones in power, we're the ones who have the agenda setting power to determine what those negotiations look like. If the longer and longer we wait, the less and less power we have to do this, because China continues to grow in influence, and that limits our power to limit China's influence in the globe as a whole. So what we're really telling you is that in today we think that China has the capacity to grow further, and what we're able to do is limit its power globally and just contain it to that particular region, which we think is best for the world as a whole, right? We furthermore tell you that at least in this case, China is a relatively trustworthy ally, right? There's a significant degree of economic codependence between China and the US. There's a high cost of conflict if the US does decide to return to that region. And there's growing democratization that can take place when we have more and more interactions between the US and China, right? The more negotiations that take place, the greater liberalization we can push onto China. That's when you see changes in Chinese foreign and domestic policy. So on the whole, we think if you view this debate from the comparative paradigm of how we best reduce China's international power, we think it's far better that we leverage the position we're in right now to limit the risk of conflict in the short term and the long term. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, so, oopsies, wait 1 second. Okay, so, China's power in the region might be inevitable, but there are two things we do control. One is the speed at which China acquires this power, and two is the character of the relations between China and actors in the area. We can permanently alter this by whether or not we withdraw quickly or slowly, or retain our military operations and influence in the area permanently. I'm going to tell you, in the first place, it's okay, like we can just stand on being slower, right? Because I think Taiwanese do care about whether or not that they get negotiations into being annexed into China now or in 10 years or 20 years, right? Or the possibility that they never be annexed into China because, two, the character of relations, right, might be different because the US stays there permanently and allows people in Taiwan to not see it as inevitable that they become annexed by China, as one example. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some refutation under the banner of soft power, hard power, and then move on to sort of a little bit more constructive on how international signaling works and how countries are going to get trapped in a security dilemma, and then additionally how diplomatic relations are zero-sum, and it is unrealistic to assume that it's unrealistic to assume that the model that they say, but we definitely will keep free trade and all the same trade that we would have in both worlds is likely to happen. Then I'm going to do a bit of extraneous refutation about sort of China's role in the world. So firstly, let's go over some refutation. So they sort of claim that our hard power is useless. What we need to do is we need to convert it into soft power, and that will result in sort of like, that'll be most efficacious use of our resources. So my first thought is like that we are sacrificing soft power. We are actually sacrificing soft power with other Southeast Asian nations, right, who like the US, that want the US to be there. They name two states, South Korea and Japan, which are in a different matrix because they are likely to become a regional power, or rather Japan's going to likely become a regional power with South Korea as its close ally into the near future. But all of the rest of Southeast Asia, right, is totally upset that we're doing this. And they're probably going to be not very happy and will change their behavior quite meaningfully. Now let me get into some constructive of sort of the actions that that cause international signaling to happen. So what happens when the United States removes warships and troops from a region, right? What happens is we signal something because actions like this are undertaken over large portions of time, and states plan in the long term. And so what that means is that you have a host of potential conflicts where countries are now perceiving the future in a far different way, right? You have islands in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, that are contested. They could go to one country or another, and all of these countries have stakes in these because of a number of factors, including like nationalism, because the support of governments in those countries, like Japan and China, right, depend partially on whether or not they're posturing sufficiently in that area. And that posturing can potentially become a conflict where people die, which is a bad thing, right? Not necessarily a full-out war, but something smaller, like my partner said, which is more characteristic of modern warfare, right? So, but there's a number of other issues as well, like Taiwan, as well as ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, as well as South Korea and North Korea, right? Let's talk about South Korea and Japan for a second, because I think a POI raised on back half is actually very interesting, because you note that Japan cares a lot about the region in question. They say China will always make the necessary military investments, and so it's sort of out of our hands, they'll become powerful anyway. So will Japan, because Japan is, right there, and they have a long-standing contestation over economic ties to all of these other countries. Their model does not guarantee that Japan will continue to have economic relations freely with all of the other countries in the region. And so that means Japan is very afraid of the US leaving the region. That the Japanese will be very likely to be more supportive of aggressive expansion of the military as well as their navy to try and increase their influence in the region such that they don't fear China getting the giant, what is functionally a large land airbase, right, in Taiwan, for example. They were likely to increase aggressive actions to try and show that, no, we're going to check you now instead of the US, which is an undesirable circumstance because trading US checks for Japanese checks is a big damaging trade-off because Japan, actually I'll take you in a second, because Japan, right, has a very long-standing, bad animosity with China, right? These people don't like each other. They can fuel nationalism by fighting over each other, not in a similar way that they can with the US.
Just earlier in this speech, you yourself conceded that Japan wanted the United States out in order for it to be able to grow into its regional identity. Which is it?
What? I did not concede that at any point in my speech. So let's move on to the security dilemma that faces other countries in Southeast Asia, right? Because all of these countries, as my partner pointed out, somewhat depend and know that they will continue to depend on in the future on the military of the United States providing warships that are, standing there and potentially able to protect their claims in South China Sea. When the US leaves and now they have these claims but don't have the same kind of expectation of support, they know that they have to get involved in the security dilemma. They have to start building their own militaries. And as my partner pointed out, and this is just uncontestable, right? When you have more warships, more jets, more arms in a region, it is far more likely that they will cause an accident, that someone will be shot over the South China Sea because of the necessary problems that come with communication and naval operations on a larger scale, right? Where actors aren't communicating with each other because they're contesting over something, and that can lead to increased conflict. That can lead to decreased trade. That can lead to all sorts of problems that we don't actually want. Second part of this, which I want to go on to, is the economic aspect that my partner outlined, right? So I've noted to you that stability in the region is obviously going to go down if you have more arms in the region, more militarization, which is, I think, a pretty clear link, right? And consequently, all of the problems inundated by that, especially with Japan taking up some of the role of regional counter-hegemon. But I also think the problem is in economic growth, because note that China cares not only primarily for its own stability, and this is contingent on both having somewhat aggressive foreign policy to appease their population's sense of nationalism and, overcoming the humiliation of beating Japan, etc., in the Second World War or whatever, and two, on the fact that some diplomacy is zero-sum, right? That when you get into a negotiation with, say, Vietnam or whatever, there is an expectation that you don't get into negotiations with the United States, right? Because China can imply this pretty heavily, or goddamn state it in a private secret meeting, right? And this can be contrary to the deal that they say that they're going to be able to uphold. But you know what? China doesn't, you don't have a military in the region anymore, and it takes a goddamn long time to shift out and then back in to be able to show China that you mean what you mean. It's not like you can just instantly apply sanctions or whatever. It's not the same as moving an entire army back in. So it means that China is likely to, in small ways and eventually in large ways, break this and actually become the zero-sum hegemon, excluding the US, excluding Japan, and so on. So they say in their final point that gentleman brings up from the second speech about how what will happen is China will focus inward on its regional hegemony and not sort of go out into Africa, and this is a form of containment. But if you, by everything else that I've said, right, it's very unlikely that they're going to not care about other parts of the world. They're just going to speed up their consolidation of East Asia and then also involve themselves in other parts of the world, gaining ideological influence, gaining power in the area, increasing instability, and increasing the chances of conflict. We want something that is a far slower, checked form of Chinese expansion. We don't get that with this resolution. Thank you very much.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and invite the government member to the floor.
don't believe they do. They say China is an export nation and that that's going to mean they're stable and good and they can do all these great things. What they actually want is to control economies so that those economies are trading exclusively with them and their partners and not with countries like the US or the rest of the West. We think that's a big problem. They can say all they want that China will change, that's going to become more stable, but until they prove that they are good, that's going to be bad. But secondly, creating a multipolar world, as I've proved to you is particularly likely to happen, or even a bipolar world where we have China and the US as very large hegemons, is clearly not going to be more stable because you're going to have different spheres of economies which are likely to be in tension. Sure, but you disagree.
You say that China wants to control other nations' economies. Does that mean you actually foresee them invading suppliers and export and import partners?
No, it means I see them using their extreme economic influence to be able to do things like cause the trade agreements to exclude other nations. We think that's particularly likely and far more likely on their side of the house when the US isn't able to be sat at the table. That's clearly what's going to happen in this round. When they talk about, and I think they made a bold concession when they tell us that China wants to follow the mold of American influence. Yes, they do. They want to be a world hegemon. This is why they're always going to want to keep expanding, because the US is the country they're modeling themselves after. They talk about peace and North Korea. Recognize something very simple. China cannot control North Korea. No one can control North Korea. So even the best benefits they can possibly try and claim about how they're going to create world peace are far less likely. No, thank you. Moving to the substantive I want to provide. First, let's talk about what actually is likely to happen and why it's particularly so bad. Why China may not, at least in the short term, become the regional hegemon. There are two countries we think are particularly important. Japan, as has been talked about, we think clearly is a rich nation that has a lot of resources, that has a lot of trade agreements, and has a lot of connections to countries like Western countries who it may turn to if it needs to, even if the U.S. does withdraw. But also just has the resources on its own to build up a military and try and counter Chinese influence. We think another nation that might be important is India, considering that's going to become like a superpower and already has a very large military. We think that when China is able to gain control over the rest of Southeast Asia, that it's going to necessitate a conflict and a tension between China and India as India continues to grow. India is a growing economy which needs to have access to these other markets that China exclusively wants to exclude from those markets because it knows it is in competition, particularly things like cheap goods, with India. That is particularly problematic because that is exactly the type of thing when Indian politicians are looking at their own people not getting the jobs those people are demanding that will lead to regional and maybe even global conflict. Clearly that's a terrible thing. So what are we going to see? Not a clear hegemony, but instead a three-way battle for control of the region. We think that's very bad. Moreover, we think it's more likely to lead to conflict than with the US because we see, particularly Japan, a really long history of violence. Even now, the after effects of things like the rape of Nanking, of things like the comfort women, that like a few weeks ago were still being debated about the role that played in Afghan conflict. But what's like that long history makes it particularly likely that Japan will want to push off and draw bright red lines at when China oversteps its bounds. We think that's particularly problematic because they're more likely to violence, which is the worst outcome in this round. But the second thing I want to talk about is why current US we tell you that as the internet and trade grow, I talked about this a little bit, countries are becoming more intertwined. The problem is that this hasn't completed and isn't near completion in the next year or two. Why is this really bad? Or really important? Because as we see these countries intertwine, the country that is the hegemon has a distinct ability to influence the way this intertwining happens. If China is able to become a hegemon, they're able to control things like access to internet in other countries. They're also able to control things like where those countries trade. Everyone is trading with everyone else. That is a stable world. If we say a world where we have two spheres of trade, that is an unstable world where war is more likely to happen. This leads to my third point, why a world conflict is more likely to lead to violence. Recognize that China will continue to want to expand. As we see, they wanted those rocks in the water because it gives them access to international trade routes, which is showing why they want to expand. Recognize also that, there are way more interests involved when we have a world conflict. When two countries get into conflicts that are irrelevant to China and the US, but now they are both global powers, they will both see it as having meaning, and both see it as tools to use against the other person, which means you're likely to lead to violence. Also, it's closer to the US's home, which means they are more likely to lead to violence, and they are more likely to elect warlike politicians because they feel more scared. We're so proud to oppose.
opposition member and invite the government whip.
It was strange in this debate that people were talking about China as being the biggest imperialistic power that needed to be curtailed and stopped. As if the biggest imperial power in the 20th century hadn't been repeatedly the United States of America. The question in this debate is about actually looking at the incentives that operate on regards to China, that operate on regards to America and Japan. Because no one actor exerting influence in a region will be perfect. But this debate operated on a comparative, and you have to look at why China is a better actor, all things considered, than America in this region at this time in this context. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, I want to explore what China's incentives actually are in the region and how they compare to the United States. And secondly, question how important America is in providing stability. To the first question about China's incentives. What does China want, Mr. Speaker? By the opposition's language, you'd suggest they want total control over the Asian region and were invading countries willy-nilly, and the only thing stopping them was America. Let's actually look at what they want. The first thing is that China has huge incentives in a one-nation policy. The reason that they are particularly interested in territories like Tibet is because they view it as territorially their own. That logic does not similarly apply to nations like Japan or nations like South Korea. Why are they interested in the territory around Japan? They're interested in it because it secures their supply chains and trade routes. The reason that they're particularly interested in land up of Japan is because it allows them access to trade routes in Africa. The reality is that without the presence of an American military force in Japan, it is very likely that China and Japan, because it is mutually beneficial for them, will negotiate in order to provide trade routes up through Japan, allowing China to ship their goods and without the need to engage in military conflict. How does that change when there's a US presence? Because the reality is that the US has an outmoded and outdated idea of China. It is the exact outdated, outmoded idea of China as propagated by the opposite bench. They say we can't let China have power, that we can't give them trade routes because they're big and scary and we don't understand their languages or cultural practices. That's the sort of language that means that Japan is encouraged not to engage in negotiations with China when the reasons that they were previously antagonistic are increasingly being appeased by inter-countries' ability to negotiate between one another. But the other thing we'd point out is that China's political system is entirely reliant on their economic system. The only reason that the political structures in China are remaining as they are is because China is the most prosperous nation in the world at the moment. That means that the Chinese government has huge incentives to create economic and regional stability. Why is that important? Because it means that they're very unlikely, no thank you, to do things that will fuck up their ability to move trade between things, like engaging in a giant war with the country that stands between them and a major one of their markets, i.e. Africa. That's particularly important. But also, how does this compare to a country like America? We'd say that America's interests in the region are largely posturing. It means that they get all cranky when China flies over the Southeast Sea and gets up on their little podium in front of the American flag, but doesn't actually do anything. That means you inflame tensions in the region without providing any kind of actual military support to that region. We think that the reality probably is that Japan loses territory over piddly little pieces of territory that are being encouraged to be fought over by countries like America. We don't think that that is hugely tragic. We also think that there's an important role that China has in regards to relations with North Korea. What was the response from closing? No one can control North Korea, they're just so crazy. But the reality is that it's comparative. Who Who can better stop North Korea detonating nuclear weapons on South Korea? We think that when you look at the fact that China has previously had economic and diplomatic relations with North Korea, they're in a far more favorable position to engage in the sorts of negotiations that stabilize the region. Moreover, they have incentives to do so because the flooding of immigrants from, no thank you, North Korea into China is hugely destabilizing, which encourages them to stabilize the region. At the end of that question, we see that China is an actor that shouldn't be feared, that should be encouraged. But to the second question, is there some kind of need for an American presence that lies beyond this? The first aspect I want to deal with is the closings extension. The idea that Japan will militarily build up and destroy the China hegemon such that our model crumbles into what, total war. The first thing to say is practical. Japan cannot build up an army that will take on China's sufficient that they have any incentives to do so. We'd point to the fact that they have been, since the 1940s, entirely militarily reliant on America. That would make it difficult for them to suddenly become a military powerhouse, able to take on China, which you and your teams themselves have acknowledged is one of the world's greatest superpowers. What is the more likely response Japan is going to have? It is more likely that they're going to cede an understanding that they can no longer be a fair or equal opponent militarily to a country like China, and they're likely to engage in practices that are more conciliatory, opening.
We gave you countless examples where China has been imperialistic despite US influence. The fact that the US is willing to fly B-52s over the Spratly Islands signals to Southeast Asian nations they can bargain for fairer trade deals, freedom of movement, and other important things that you don't get when China is the exclusive hegemon.
The problem with your analysis is that you suggest that the only way that China can wield power, or that an American can wield power, is if they have military bases there, as if they're not able to exert power in the region or negotiate between countries by doing things like engaging in the TPP, which excluded China and was able to build a trading bloc that was used in negotiations and to limit the rise of Chinese economic manipulation and power. The reality is that the military presence of America in the region is counterproductive. We would prefer that they turn to other mechanisms like economic, like soft power, to engage in the diplomacy that you're looking at. What was the other thing we heard from closing? We heard that India is likely to engage in frictions between China. The reality is that nothing in this debate is changing the relationship between China and India. To the extent that America is likely to intervene in that context, they are equally as likely to do so under either side. We're not particularly sure how that's relevant to this topic. But the last thing we want to question is how good America is at protecting the regions. Because the reality is that America enjoys being in Okinawa and enjoying that military base without doing much good. The reality is that most of the military troops in Okinawa are engaging in sexual assault, the destruction of cultural sites and languages, and the people of Japan want them out. Mr. Speaker, at the end of this debate, China is not to be feared. They're to be encouraged as a global actor, proud to propose.
I thank the government whip and invite the opposition whip to close out the debate.
Okay, everyone ready? Great. So my 3 points of crystallization for this round are going to be about the 3 possibilities that we've discussed this afternoon. A US remaining status quo, a China is the hegemon of the region, and a what-if situation where there is no strong regional hegemon. But before that, a small point of rebuttal. We hear from the government whip that the opposition bench has an outmoded view of China because we are too concerned about the past. The way I see this is that we are basing our assumptions on the history of the region, where we get this very fantastic view of what is going to happen out of the government, especially closing government, who seems to think that China will be a perfectly moral actor relative to the US is not perfect, but at the very least, the narrative that they create is in favor of things like liberal democracy and free trade, whereas the narrative China creates is that they have a right to control the region because they historically controlled the region. All the US cares about is free trade so that they can make money. China has much more perverse incentives. So, that said, What happens if the United States remains something like the status quo? We tell you that broadly this has been extremely peaceful in the region since 1945 under American hegemony. We tell you that you get comparatively less Chinese hegemony or imperialism when the Americans are there. When the Americans insist on sailing aircraft carriers through international waters as close as they can get to the Chinese waters, that prevents China from doing things like invading Taiwan. Inasmuch as Taiwan is a country independent of China today and wishes to remain so, it is because the Americans are there to prevent an invasion. Obviously, China would easily be able to overpower Taiwan without the Americans remaining, and has huge incentives to do so in terms of like irredentism and desire to reclaim their territory. But aside from this, we tell you, as a brief bit of rebuttal, that they talk a lot about how on their side of the house they better control North Korea. Yet in the status quo, China has all the same incentives to control North Korea because they don't want to get involved in a new conflict on the Korean Peninsula. This doesn't happen on either side of the house any more likely than on the other. No, thank you. But on top of that, under the model, as we hear from opening government, the US doesn't just magically leave Japan and South Korea overnight. This is going to drag on over 20 years. So for the next 20 years, or 15, whatever Kyle said, the US is still going to remain, is still going to be putting pressure on China, and the Japanese are going to have that 15 years to remilitarize, so this undercuts everything that we heard out of the government whip about why they won't be able to militarize. But on top of that, it's absurd for them to say that Japan can't militarize. Its economy is only slightly smaller than China's. It can buy weapons from the US and Europe. This is just silly. So, that said, no thanks, I'll take you later, Kyle. We tell you about the second possibility, which is what happens if there is a Chinese hegemony in the region. We tell you that countries like Japan are going to feel a need to demilitarize to defend themselves against Chinese hegemony, and that this pressure is going to lead to more investment in military in the region. So we hear from OO a little bit about how this might lead to conflicts if someone accidentally shoots down a jet, like what happened in Turkey with Russia recently. But aside from that, we tell you this is bad because countries are investing in their militaries rather than in trade. They're dividing from each other and actually hurting the world economy rather than working together to build stronger trade. But this is also a fearsome situation for small countries that aren't as powerful as Japan. Maybe Japan can defend themselves from China, but countries like Vietnam certainly can't, and that's why these countries, as my partner tells you, support the US remaining in the region. But aside from this, and tremendously important, Chinese hegemony in East Asia is not only an East Asian problem. China shares a tremendously long land border with another country that will be a superpower in this century, India. We think it's problematic that this wasn't mentioned sooner in the round. The fact that China and India are both huge economies, both have large militaries, both have nuclear weapons, both are developing very quickly towards regional hegemony is going to lead to them butting heads in the same way that when you had the US and the Soviet Union butting heads in the 20th century, this led to harmful outcomes. We don't see why that won't be the case when you have two, at the very least, great powers in South Asia and China butting heads. And a stronger China only increases the pressure on India relative to the status quo, where China is not as strong relative to India. I'd love to take over.
Okay, so you talk about how Japan will have a 15-year heads up on US withdrawal. Why isn't this slower, structured, gradualist approach that we bring you from opening government a better transition of power than the alternative on your side of the house?
So on our side of the house, we're not necessarily saying that China is ever going to be the hegemon. We hear two what-ifs. On OO, they talk a little bit about the what-if China does not become the sole hegemon, and they talk a lot about the what-if as if China does become the hegemon. On CO, we told you a lot about the what-if China does not become the hegemon. Sure, the model is better than the Americans leaving on Monday, but it still has a lot of harms. So, that said, what happens if there is no regional hegemon? This is probably the most concerning scenario for every party involved. My partner told you about why hegemony leads to peace, why the knowledge that one country can protect other countries lets them feel that they don't need to militarize, lets them feel that they can interact in a peaceful way that leads to better growth. So if you have no hegemon, this seems like the scenario that leads to the most violence out of every scenario presented in the round. Why? Because what you see isn't really a situation with hegemons anymore. It's more like a situation with great powers, like Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. A situation where Japan and China and maybe South Korea and maybe India are all quite powerful. As once Britain and France and Germany and Austria were all quite powerful in Europe. And this situation leads to buying, leads to conflict, leads to false alliances, leads to countries feeling pressure to militarize relative to one another. You only heard this out of closing opposition, and this is important because this is the scenario that's most likely to lead to large-scale conflict in the region that is almost impossible to imagine as long as there are American aircraft carriers in the Sea of Japan. But this model is also the worst for commerce, and this is terrible for people around the world. So in the status quo, the reason why China can invest in Africa, like we hear so much about out of the government whip, is because they're able to freely trade. The reason why almost every country in the world can access free trade is because the Americans keep free trade open because they have no claim to these waters. So they want it to be open to the international community so that they can make money off of it. So American aircraft carriers ensure that different countries are able to trade in different regions around the world. In as much as this is true, the US has an incentive to keep this trade open to all countries, whereas China, who may have a claim to closing it off to some countries, does not have the same incentives. This is bad for trade. Sure, China can trade with Africa on our side of the house, but so can Japan. On their side of the house, we can imagine that a conflict between China and Japan could lead to a closing in trade here. This hurts the global economy. We tell you that any barriers to global trade are ultimately bad for the world as a whole, and they are most likely in this scenario when China is not a regional hegemon and when the US has abandoned the regional hegemony and there are now a bunch of great powers all vying with one another. We tell you also that Cold War scenarios simply are not good. You heard this out of my partner's speech. But they lead to things like proxy wars, where China and Japan might both be backing smaller Asian countries in a conflict. And this is bad not only for those smaller countries who are put in awkward positions, but for China and Japan because it damages trade. It forces them to waste resources on proxy wars. We saw how expensive this was for the Soviet Union and the Americans in the 20th century, how it ultimately harmed both countries. So in as much as this is true, we think the worst possible world is one with no hegemony, and then one with Chinese hegemony is still ultimately worse than what we have today. For all of these reasons, I encourage an opposition ballot.
Thank the opposition whip, invite the